Hello again, my fellow Jeti users, and welcome back to my workshop for another of my little Jeti videos. In this one, we are going to take a look at flight modes. What do you do with them? How can you use them? And the reason I've decided to do this is that recently I've had quite a few requests for a bit of help with what should people be doing with flight modes, and it's coincided with similar sorts of questions turning up on internet forums. So I thought it's time to take a little look at these. And so I certainly can't give you the definitive list of things to do with flight modes because it's limited very much by your imagination. You can do an immense amount with them. But we'll take a look at really what you do with them. If you have no familiarity with flight modes, may I suggest you take a look at my video entitled Managing Flight Modes, which takes you through the flight modes screen here about setting them up, what the priorities are, why you would want delays, switches, assigning sound files to them, etc. But people have gone on to ask, well, fine, what do I do with a flight mode? What can I use it for, or should I be using it? Or some people think it's just for complicated gliders. It's not. It's a great tool for many models, not all of them. But I certainly use flight modes on any model that has flaps, which means virtually every one of my power models as well as gliders, so the jets and prop models, because it's very useful there. Another video that's very useful to have a look at once you've got going with flight modes would be my video about the multi-servo wing episode 3, I think it is, doing flaps by flight modes and using the flap menu. And I'll link to both of those videos, that one and the managing flight modes, at the end of this video. So what do we do once we've created the flight modes? Well, you'll find in a lot of menus there is a little symbol with a G in it, and you can change that to an S. And what it means is that the screen you're looking at will apply G globally. In other words, whatever is set there applies through all of the flight modes you've created. Or S, you've got a new screen for each flight mode. And imagine suddenly if you change it to S, there is a new screen for every one of the flight modes you've created, and each of those screens is totally independent. The only snag is because the screen we're looking at is only one screen wide, you can't stack up all the screens alongside one another, so you're only looking at one screen at a time. It's got its label up here from the flight mode, but each of them is completely independent. In a way, you're creating a sort of sub-model for each time you're doing it. Okay, what's the first one that allows us to change G to S? Well, it's digital trim. And in here you can see that each of your functions has a G against it, which you can change to an S. For example, elevator, change that to separate. And now, in each of your flight modes, the elevator trim is completely independent from each of the other flight modes. In other words, if we say in normal flight mode, normal, you've got your model trimmed, doesn't need any trim, but when you change to another flight mode, you need to use a little bit of down trim. And so if we watch the value here, I need a little bit of down trim. I'll go back to the normal flying mode, watch the value, it goes back to 0. Go back to the takeoff mode, 14. Now I'll go on to another flight mode, land. Let's say it needed that value of the elevator trim. And now, as we switch between the flight modes, they've each got a completely independent trim, and yet I was pressing the same trim button. And this is great for setting up the trim on things like different flap settings. So much easier to do than using a flap to elevator mix, which is where most people's thinking tends to go first, because then you've got to take a guess at what the mix value might be and try it out, and it's not right, and then you land and you change the mix value a bit and you tweak it. Whereas if you just use flight modes with separate trim, you can get your different flap settings trimmed for pitch within seconds. Very, very easy to do. Okay, move on from there. Flight mode trim. Right, these are sort of fixed values that you can put in. And we can see again that each of your functions has a G or an S. And let's pick S for ailerons. So now what we're going to do here is put in a fixed value of trim. Now the word trim tells us something important. Like sub-trims or the trim buttons, every click here, every 1% here, is actually only 0.5% of normal value. So if you were to dial up 100% here, your ailerons would actually only move 50% of the normal 100% travel. Okay, so trim has limitations on what you do. But the great thing here is that for example, ailerons or flaps, in the case of a glider, you could use small values to give you a little bit of thermal mode or speed mode. And in some power models, I think, for instance, the CARF Hawk, whether it's a CARF recommendation or user's recommendation, that they trim up the ailerons a little bit, just a little bit of reflex on landing helps it settle down. So that's why you would come in here, set it to S, go to your landing mode. There we are in landing mode. Come in, dial in a value, whatever is needed to move the ailerons the amount you want. And now, as you change mode, there's the mode, there's the value, change the mode, different value, different mode, different value. Like I said, it's like having 3 different screens. Well, I've got 3 flight modes, so it's 3 screens, could be 2, could be 5, could be 7 flight modes. But imagine all the screens laid out left to right, but you're only allowed to look at one of them at a time. So check the name, and where it's S, you've got a completely new set of values. But not just values. If there are curves or switches in that screen, those will be available as well to be completely new. Let's have a look. Dual rate, exponential. Let's set our ailerons, shall we? No, we'll pick elevator. We'll change that to separate. So now imagine you've got 3, because we've got 3 flight modes, 3 different dual rate expo screens stacked left to right. We just happen to be looking at the normal one. Now we're looking at the takeoff one. Now we're looking at the landing one. And they are completely independent of one another. For example, let's go into landing mode. We'll set it to separate, and we'll set the rate down to 50. Near enough. I'm not saying you'd ever use these on the model. These are just for demonstration purposes, remember. Okay, and the expo would be, well, let's whiz it that way, something like that. Okay, now when I change mode, I'll be back to everything back to normal. So let's leave takeoff like that, and let's go to normal flying mode, and let's say I want to have dual rates in this flying mode, but I don't want them in the others. Not a problem. Come down to here, we'll set a switch, and if I switch it to the on position, go to our rate. So now in the normal flight mode, I've got a switch, and I can switch between my different rates. But if I go to the takeoff flight mode, there is no switch set. We're back at that rate. And we go to the landing flight mode, there is no switch set. So we're back at that rate there. So I can move the switch, nothing happens in landing mode. Same in takeoff mode, dual rate switch, doesn't work. But come to normal, it's got a switch, now it works. Remember, you've got to think for every flight mode there is a completely separate screen. We're only allowed to see one of those screens at a time, that's all. Okay, now function curves. We've got a completely separate function curve for each one. Again, go to here. Let's pick air brake as an example. Go along here, change it to separate. This, by the way, in case you're ever wondering about these ticks, this is will any delay that you created in the flight mode screen apply to this control? And by default, throttle is no, it won't. You can change that if you want, but the default is that even if you have a slow transition between flight modes, the change to throttle will be available to you immediately. So that's all. You can switch them on or off as you desire. Okay, let's have a look at the air brake. Right, once again, because we've changed it to separate, as confirmed by here, we've got 3 completely separate function curves now for the air brake. Why should I want that? Well, just suppose I want to have the air brake. Let's move the lever. There you are. See the little gun sight moving? I'm moving my air brake lever. I only want that to work in the landing mode. We're in landing mode. I want it to work. Lovely. Let's leave it there. Let's come to takeoff mode. Let's say I want to disable the air brakes, not just stop the lever from moving them, but of course I want them locked in the closed position. And we'll say that the closed position is with the lever up here. Yeah? Well, I can do that. I can change it to a constant curve. Come down into here and rattle it up to there. Now I can change to normal mode as well. Oops. Change that to a constant curve. Come down into there. Rattle it up. And now, watch, normal is a constant, locked up there. See the gun sight's moving because I'm moving the lever, but the vertical movement, which is the function output that the servo would follow, isn't moving. So no matter what I do with the lever, the air brakes are locked shut. Same with takeoff, air brakes are locked shut. Go to landing and I've got that curve. So now you've seen that if it's in that screen, we can change values, we can change the switch, and we can change the curve. Okay. Let's have a look. What else can we do? Aileron differential. Once again, you could have different values of aileron differential for your different flight modes. You just come in, change it to S, and now all of these can be different for every mode. Butterfly, flaps. If you don't fly gliders, ignore the fact this says butterfly. This tends to put people off and make them think, oh, this is a glider person's menu. No, there's the big clue, flaps. For power models that have flaps, this is by far and away the best way to set up your flaps. It's not the only way, but it is, I think, the easiest and most powerful way to do it. So, as I mentioned before, if you want to learn how to do it, have a look at my multi-servo wing episode 3, which I will link to at the end of this video. Okay, we've set it to S, separate. Let's have a look. What can we do? Well, this is our flaps. Let's say we want to put it on a slider. So I choose the control, do that. Say okay, we're in landing mode, by the way. Now, because I've set the control in landing mode, doesn't mean there's a control in the others. So I can go to landing mode, and I now have control proportionally over the flaps, for example. And similarly, coming down to any of the values in here, the elevator adjustment, separate, and even all your tuning is separate per flight mode. Snap rolls, not something I use, but again, can be set to separate. In other words, you could set the switch will only work in certain flight modes. And that way you can guarantee that it won't work in other flight modes. So even if you knock it accidentally coming into land, if you're in landing mode, it isn't going to work. Free mixes, yep, even they can be set to work only in certain flight modes. Let's have a look. Go in here. Aileron to rudder. It's global at the moment. In other words, in every flight mode it'll work. Let's change that just by pressing the button. S, it's separate. I'll prove it now. Let's say you want the ailerons to rudder to be switchable on and off, but only in the normal flight mode. Well, we'll bung in a value, set a switch for it, say OK to that, and there we are. Now, if I change to any other flight mode, there is no mix and no switch. So even if I'd left it switched on, the mix would be off in takeoff or landing mode. The switch only appears there. Notice, by the way, I can assign different switches. In the normal mode, I've assigned switch F as the switch for it. But if I go to the takeoff mode, I could assign switch H to switch it on and off in that mode. See that? So normal mode, F is the free mixer switch. Takeoff mode, H is the free mixer switch. Get your mind into thinking that, remember, with every flight mode, separate screens all the way along, completely independent of one another. Okay, well, that takes you through most of the things that can be set, but there are a couple of others, and they're in timer sensors. Timers themselves, edit, try going right down to the bottom of the timer menu. Looky there. Which flight modes is this timer to be active in? It defaults to all. You can change it to only the displayed flight modes, and we'll come to displaying them in a moment. Or you can have it set to very specific flight modes. So this timer would only work in normal, this one would work in takeoff, and that one would work in the landing mode. So we'll set it back to all for the moment. And the other place you can have a difference is in displayed telemetry. Again, it's global. So at the moment, the flight timer will show in every flight mode. Just pop back to the front screen. There's the flight timer. It's set to global, so in every flight mode, there's the timer. However, if we change it to separate, what we could do is say normal will have a flight timer. We'll go to takeoff mode, delete that, add, we'll show flight modes in that. And in landing mode, we'll have the transmitter battery. Now, so as we switch through the modes, watch the display changes. Okay, let's have a look at what that means in real life. Here we are. So in that mode, we're showing this as displayed telemetry. In that mode, we're showing this as displayed telemetry. In that mode, we're showing this as displayed telemetry. So you can change your telemetry screens based purely on what you need to know in that mode. Although, if you've watched my other videos, you'll know I'm really against looking down at the screen when you're flying your model. My feeling is don't take your eyes off the model, use the voice output to tell you everything you need to know. But there you go, if you need to change it, you can. So that's just a brief run through of some of the things that you can do with the flight modes, and if you start to think about them, they can give you fantastic control over the model.